So just to set the scene and context for our discussion with our panel, you could say that in broad terms, there are two types of nature-related activism or engagement. The first protects nature for its use or benefit to humans. The second treats nature as a fully actualized power in its own right, which humans are part of. So we're going to be exploring those two approaches, and I want to flag right from the start that we're going to be focusing on the non-animate world. The rights of other than human animals is just not something we can do justice to in this session, and hopefully maybe we can come back to that at a different event. So for most of our time on this planet, humans have understood nature as a living force on which we depend and which is worthy of our respect and even reverence. Our festivals and agricultural cycles were based on the seasons and the movements of the sun and the moon and the stars. And modern science also confirms that we are part of an integrated living Earth system and within a wider cosmos. However, in the Western world, particular philosophies and ways of living have encouraged a view of nature as separate from humans, and as we've discussed in previous sessions, existing as mainly for the use for particular members of human society. So cultures and traditions originally in Europe which had a different view were gradually destroyed, and that violence spread through the rest of the world through colonialism. And we then had capitalist models of extraction, which again pushed beyond sought growth beyond natural limits and impacted on marginalized and excluded members of society, as we discussed last week. So through that, we've seen ills such as species extinction and disastrous climate change and massive biodiversity loss, animal cruelty, and the diseases that we're seeing that come from ecosystem destruction, to name just a few. So there remain many cultures, however, where the relationship between humans and nature has not been severed. So these include in particular Indigenous cultures. The rights of Mother Earth, or Pachamama, as nature is known in that part of the world, are included in the constitutions of Ecuador and Bolivia. In Ecuador, rights of nature cases have protected the Vilcabamba River from development by reaffirming its right to take a particular course. And they've also protected the Galapagos Islands. And there was a recent climate case in Colombia where the court held that the Amazon had legal rights in its own to itself in its own right, and that the government had a duty to protect it. Living traditions such as Hinduism, Jainism, and Buddhism emphasize the sanctity of all life, and India's constitution refers to respect for every form of life, regardless of its worth to humans. New Zealand has passed legislation making the river Whanganui a legal person represented by members of the Maori community as well as the government. Nepal is reported to be considering legal protection of the right of the Himalayas to exist as mountains. Communities in America have enacted rights of nature law, and the Ponca tribe of Oklahoma was the first tribal nation in the US to have a rights of nature statute. And with Carlotta on our panel, we will be discussing African Earth jurisprudence. However, there's still a very long way to go. There's no basic acceptance of nature having self-standing rights in many powerful societies. There was an American case relating to the rights of the Colorado River to exist, and it was withdrawn because the claimant was threatened with costs for bringing a vexatious or pointless or aggravating case, is another word of describing it, by the government. Rights of nature have also been weighed in the balance against human, social, and economic interests, rather than overriding them. They haven't stopped the push by extractive industries into indigenous territories. And nature would also have to be represented by human beings in the human legal world. And that might work, for example, if there was a community with a deep connection to the natural site concerned. But how would it work if it was a state body that also had responsibility for issuing mining consents, for example, or dam building? So a case giving the Yamuna and Ganga or Ganges rivers legal status was overturned by the Indian Supreme Court. Litigation was the culmination of years of struggle between local communities who worship these mighty rivers as goddesses, relying on them for sustenance, and the competing drive for Western-style economic growth. So there are divergences with Western-style conservation approaches here too. If the river is a goddess, some argue, she remains the one with the agency to protect humans, not the other way around. So those supporting nature rights argue that a society that had them would evolve along better lines than one that didn't. It would be harder to destroy plants and animals if they could be protected in their own right, in the same way as companies are protected, despite not being human either. But do we need to be wary of putting humans back at the top of the planetary pyramid, even in the guise of protectors? Do humans in Western and Westernized societies need to come back into right relationship with our place as part of nature in philosophical, cultural, and even spiritual terms before we can look to the law and economic systems to support this? And are we seeing signs of a reorientation towards nature in such societies? So it's clear that re-establishing a harmonious relationship with nature has never been more important or precarious, and I'm delighted to be discussing the challenges and pleasures of doing this with our multifaceted, multi-talented, inspirational panel this evening, which is made up of Carlotta Byrne, the Earth Jurisprudence Coordinator at the Gaia Foundation and former food grower, course facilitator and solicitor, Laura Guark, singer, performer, composer and workshop leader at arts company Convex, Paul Palsland, civil barrister, environmental activist, storyteller and founder of Lawyers for Nature, and Shivali Fulchand, junior doctor, editor and coordinator of the Year of Climate Change at the British Medical Journal and London project coordinator of the Bhumi or Earth project. So first of all, a very warm welcome to our panel. It's wonderful to have you here. And I'd like you to each, one by one, perhaps explain a little bit about the work that you do and your interest in this topic. So if I could start off in the order that I introduced you with Carlotta first, please.
Sure, thank you, Geeta. And it's a pleasure to be with everybody this evening. So as Geeta said, I coordinate the Earth Jurisprudence Programme at the Gaia Foundation. And for those who don't yet know the Gaia Foundation, we're an NGO based in the UK. We work internationally. And over the past 35 years, the Gaia Foundation has worked with a global network to revive biocultural diversity, to regenerate healthy ecosystems, and to restore a respectful relationship with and love for Mother Earth. And much of the work that we do is with traditional and Indigenous communities to revive their earth-centred traditions, their customary governance systems, and to protect their sacred natural sites. The philosophy that underpins the work that we do is Earth Jurisprudence, which I'll say more about shortly. And as part of our work on Earth Jurisprudence, or EJ, as I will refer to it interchangeably, as Earth Jurisprudence can be a bit of a mouthful. As part of our work on EJ, one of the global networks that we work with is the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature, of which we're a founding member. So through our EJ programme, we work with communities and civil society in several countries in Africa to strengthen an African Earth Jurisprudence movement, as well as collaborating with an international movement for the recognition of Earth-centred law. And we also deliver a 3-year training programme on various aspects of Earth Jurisprudence to a network of civil society leaders in Africa that, through the process, graduate as Earth Jurisprudence practitioners and most often go on to accompany Indigenous communities in the revival of their customary governance. Now, whilst rights of nature will be familiar in some shade or degree for most listening this evening, Earth Jurisprudence may not be. It's a term that was conceived of by an eco-theologian, Thomas Berry, around the turn of this century, and it began as a radical philosophy of law and governance, calling for a transformation of our consciousness and our institutions from a human-centred to an earth-centred paradigm. So from a relationship of exploitation with the natural world, conceived of as property, resource, commodity, for human use, to a mutually enhancing and respectful human-earth relationship in which the inherent value and rights of each member of the earth community are recognised. So this is what Thomas Berry understood to be the great work of our time, to make this seismic transition. And so Earth Jurisprudence is broad in its vision. It's about systemic transformation of law, but also economics, education, politics, so that all of our social systems safeguard the integrity and well-being of the Earth as a whole, rather than serving the economic interests of a single species at great ecological cost to the planet. And this philosophy is the basis of a vibrant Earth Jurisprudence movement that has been growing over the past 20 years, predominantly focusing on law, and described in the latest UN Harmony with Nature report as the fastest growing legal movement of the 21st century. And how does it relate to rights of nature? Well, EJ is the underpinning philosophy of much of the rights of nature legislation and court decisions that Geeta has referenced in her introduction, that have been particularly emerging over the past decade. And one of the key principles of Earth jurisprudence is that every member of the Earth community, whether a living being or a component of an ecosystem, has three inherent rights: the right to be, the right to habitat, and the right to fulfill its role in the ever-renewing processes of the Earth. And these rights are not equivalent to human rights. They're species or role-specific, and they ensure that each constituent member of our living Earth is able to perform its unique role, which is understood to be integral to the well-being of the planet as a whole. And most legal systems, as we'll go on to explore, I'm sure, are human-centred. So they recognise humans and human-governed organisations as sole central subjects of law. They serve human interests with limited regards for wider ecological realities and with total blindness to humans' interdependence with the wider web of life. And rights and nature mechanisms, by contrast, they decenter the human. They resituate us as a rights-bearing subject of law among many others in the natural world. So rights and nature is part of this earth-centered paradigm that EJ is seeking to catalyse. And just to close now, I want to comment that as well as the rights of nature, there are other forms of earth-centred law. So many of you will be familiar with ecocide, and another example are the laws and governance systems of Indigenous peoples. And very briefly, these Indigenous laws have governed communities over generations, sometimes since time immemorial. They predate our state laws by many centuries, and they guide communities to live in respectful relationship with the wider Earth community and to acknowledge responsibility to that ecosystem, as well as balancing human interests against those of the local ecosystem. So these laws don't expressly use the language of the rights of nature because rights are a Western legal concept, but recognition of the rights of nature is inherent within these laws. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Well, that's a very reassuring to hear that this is the fastest growing legal movement in the 21st century. So that's a positive way to start. Laura, if you'd like to follow.
Yes, hi everyone, and thank you for inviting me. I am a performance leader, singer and composer, as Geeta mentioned. I co-direct the artistic company Convex with Sarah, my colleague Sarah Lekang-Sang, which is also on the call with us. At Convex, we create collective experiences that give threatened environments a voice, with the aim to provoke thoughtful awareness on these threatened environments and our relationship with them. In our events, what happens is that people come together in a place, they take part in an experience that usually includes elements of walking and promenades articulated on that place, and elements of immersive singing, sonic art, also articulated in that place. And one of the pieces, the performances that we created recently was Talweg, which was a participatory performance about river rights and connection to nature that we articulated along the River Thames in Rotherhithe and presented at Totally Thames 2019.
Great, thanks, Laura. And it's wonderful to have you here to bring in the wider sense of the different ways that we can connect. And it'll be really wonderful to hear a bit more about the work that you did with Talweg and engaging with community relationships with the river. So I'm looking forward to hearing that a little bit later on. Next, we have Paul, please.
Hi, everyone. So a little potted history of how I became involved in the rights of nature and advocating for nature. I qualified as an ordinary barrister a decade ago and was just, I guess, interested in a normal law career. And then during my 20s, I very much fell in love with nature and with the natural world. And I think I'll be talking about that later on. There's a specific question about that, so I'll save some more details about that for there. And that didn't actually really go across to my legal career very much. I'm not an environmental lawyer. I just do ordinary civil law as part of my day job. I'm in my office right now. But I sort of started feeling that was somehow wrong, where it was uncomfortable that I had this deep love for nature in my private life and in some of my activism, but I wasn't actually doing that in my job. And so I began to try and look for ways to bring the two together a little bit. And I started with trees, partially because I spent quite a lot of time planting trees, which, as many of you know, is a lovely thing to do, but also really frustrating because they die really easily. and everyone else is planting trees, and they don't really. A lot of them die. At least in my experience, over half. And actually, this drought-ridden spring has actually caused the majority of the trees I planted to die, which is really sad. And that made me think, well, actually, like, you know, nature's already planted a lot of these trees, and the ones that are already planted are doing really well. So maybe as well as planting them, we should, you know, look after the ones we already have and stop chopping them down as a bare minimum. So I started looking into that, and I basically just went on a Facebook group, like a tree lovers Facebook group, and posted if anyone knew of a group for lawyers to give their time free to protect trees, presuming there would be such a group, and it turns out there wasn't. It's been a constant surprising journey of how little lawyers are actually involved in this stuff a lot of the time. But someone directed me to Sheffield and said, have you checked out what's happening in Sheffield? And I hadn't heard of that. But as many of you know, that was one of the biggest grassroots environmental campaigns of the past decade, in which local people were trying to stop 17,000 of their mature street trees being chopped down. And I contacted the people involved in the Sheffield dispute, and they said, thank God you've contacted us. We need an advice from a QC who's a specialist in trade union law by the end of the weekend, or the whole campaign is over and we're going to lose the trees. And I was like, well, I'm not a QC, that's like a very senior lawyer, and I have no idea about that area of law, and I'm going on holiday tonight, but I'll do my best. And so in the evenings while I was on holiday, I wrote them this advice, and they handed it to the police on Monday morning, and the police stopped arresting people standing under the trees, and the campaign carried on from there. And there's a specific tree up in Sheffield called the owl tree, which was the final tree, the next tree due to be chopped down on that morning, and it's still there. And it's one of my favourite trees in the world as a result, and I've been to see it a few times. And that was a wonderful feeling. I don't think that may be my peak of my career. I don't know, because you rarely get that as a lawyer. Normally with law, even if you're right, you hand over an advice and the police basically throw it in the bin and carry on doing what they're doing. That they actually listened and it actually made a difference is incredible. And so I then spent 2 years representing and advising the Sheffield tree protesters, and eventually, of course, they won. And I'll be talking about that a little bit further on as well. And that really made me realise that there's a real lack of a legal support for ordinary people who are taking direct action to protect nature. There's amazing organisations like Client Earth and Friends of the Earth and Greenpeace doing a lot of stuff, but actually, in terms of representing local people who are often trying to save their own nature, there's very little. So I set up Lawyers for Nature to offer that support. So the sort of tagline for Lawyers for Nature is representing the natural world and all who seek to defend it. And I also helped set up Lawyers for Extinction Rebellion last year. And in my own personal time, I do a lot of nature-related projects, kind of trying to contrast the kind of heady, officey legal stuff with a bit of practical nature protection. So I set up the River Roading project in East London, which is a community boat project to restore the river and try and maybe get it some rights as well. And our Facebook is Friends of the River Roading for that. And I'll be again talking about that as an example during my talk later.
Great. Thanks so much, Paul, for articulating that journey between aligning what your personal interests and passions are with a world that's very much oriented, particularly in the law, towards a particular way of doing things, and how you've managed to marry those two together. So that's great. Shivali?
Hi, good evening, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here with such an amazing, inspiring panel of speakers. So I'm a doctor in training, but I've taken a year out this year to work as an editor at the British Medical Journal. And I suppose unexpectedly, I probably picked one of the most interesting and challenging years of our generation to be pursuing something like this. I guess at medical school, I suppose I couldn't decide which human organ I liked the most. So I could never really commit to a specialty. I just knew that the NHS wasn't coping with the demand at the time, and that led to often poor levels of care being provided. And one of the things that we learnt early on is that key indicator of our quality of life is the life expectancy. Now in London, if you compare the life expectancy between two areas, between Marble Arch and Whitechapel, just a few stops away, the life expectancy falls by around 20 years. This was significant for me, and it kind of made me realise there's bigger factors at play that's influencing health rather than just what we're doing in the hospital. And doctors are often on the kind of receiving line of this, and they're treating the consequence of poor prevention strategies. So 3 key areas of interest emerged for me at this time: public and global health, health policy, and the effective communication of this through scientific literature and journalism. And alongside all of this, of course, the threat of climate change, which I was always aware of early on, but it just wasn't taught at medical school at all. So in my spare time, I worked with an international faith-based environmental charity to kind of bridge this gap between the health and environment. With another team, I advocated for river rights in India, and one river in particular, the Yamuna River. And the Yamuna is probably the most polluted river in India at the moment, and one statistic shows that 23% of children living along this river have lethal levels of lead in their blood, causing all sorts of problems, including neurological deficits. So the relationship between health and environment is deeply connected, and it's heavily emphasized through many spiritual traditions, but it's often omitted from the medical conversations that I was having. But now we're seeing that increasing recognition is being given. Another medical journal, The Lancet, is pretty vocal about this as well, and calls climate the biggest global health threat of the 21st century. And one of the most pressing global health issues of our generation is the state of our environment and climate change. And through this, I was given the opportunity to lead at the British Medical Journal our year of climate change, as COP26 was meant to be held this year. Obviously, it's been delayed to next year now. But still, we're carrying on our efforts, and we had threefold changes that we implemented within our organisation. First, changes in the way we work as an organisation, our national strategy, and also our communication with doctors and policymakers. We launched a divestment campaign for health organisations to move away from fossil fuel investments. We advocated government on behalf of health and climate issues, and most importantly, we present analyses and science linking health to climate. Interestingly, the impacts on human health of climate change is often overlooked. When I go to press conferences on climate change, journalists are often surprised that someone from a medical journal is there. However, health professionals like myself, I believe, are uniquely placed, as we are the ones that will be treating the effects of us mistreating the environment. And we have a scientific background to support this kind of evidence-based approach. Unfortunately, the work that we do in the hospital is also leading to a large amount of pollution. Healthcare's emissions globally is 4.4%, which is not much lower than aviation. If healthcare was a country, it would be the 5th largest emitter in the world. So we have a dual responsibility to patients and also to society at large. And we've seen from this pandemic that our relationship to nature can't be ignored. And as doctors and scientists, we must support the effort to create the necessary paradigm shifts to facilitate these changes. And so this is where I'm trying to contribute in my work.
Great, thanks so much, Shivali, and thanks for speaking to that compartmentalization issue where one area is looked at in isolation from another, and the connection between climate change or inequality and health impacts isn't being recognized. So that's really amazing you're doing work in that area. So I think that's super key and really wonderful to have your expertise here. And as you say, it is the medical staff, as we're seeing now, the carers that are dealing with the consequences of these decisions made further down in different systems. And so it's great to have you with us. So now I'm going to move into our specific questions to panelists. So Paul, would you say it's possible to solve something to environmental problems or climate change without having rights of nature?
I think fundamentally the way that the law views nature as a property and a resource for humans' use only is leading us to our own destruction. And I don't think it is very feasible to solve the ecological or the climate crisis without addressing that fundamental issue at the root of it. But also, I would say, I kind of agree with the idea of Charles Eisenstein that actually it may in fact be possible to carve out some kind of future for humanity where we don't align with nature, where we live in sort of technology bubbles surrounded by concrete and everything denatured. We may be able to survive like that in a technical sense, but will we actually want to? And so I think it's almost certain to say that if we want to survive the current crisis in a way that is also keeps our souls, I think, and keeps us in alignment with the way that humans, I think, truly want to be, then it has to involve some addressing of the rights of nature.
Yeah. Sorry, carry on.
No, no. Are you going to pose the next question?
Oh no, I was just in response to what you just said. There was we spoke last week in terms of the climate. We looked at very much at climate justice, and even responding to that Charles Eisenstein opinion. I mean, a certain part of society perhaps could manage that, but had access to technology and a certain level of resource. But if you look at the global population, that really wouldn't be possible. And also, so you can look at solutions through a lens of, okay, this is a small specific group of people, and then nature, people who don't fall within that group, people who are impacted in the way Shivali was talking about, just don't even form part of the equation. So that's just going to be my observation. But do carry on.
Yeah, and I was just going to sort of talk about the kind of original sin, I suppose, of law, and particularly in relation to English law, because actually so many of the problems that we now see in the world have been exported through colonialism, through the legal system, from England, and actually very specifically from a certain very small part of England as well. I was actually writing an article for an organisation called Middle Temple, which is one of the 4 barristers' Inns of Courts, which I'm a member of, and a guy called Blackstone, who was a member there. He wrote the first textbook on English law, and many of his ideals have permeated out into the world through the common law system and through being forced upon people by English colonialism. And he originally came up with the idea of property and what gives property rights. And he said, "The earth, therefore, and all things therein are the general property of all mankind, exclusive of other beings, from the immediate gift of the Creator." So it's a very Christian, biblical view of nature as property and resource. And it is this idea which we have spread around, which has possibly been one of the most poisonous and appalling that we have done in this legal system. Actually, this is at the root of so many other problems. That's, I suppose, and I'm going to talk in this talk particularly about the English system, because that's the one I know best about. But obviously, I think it's worth bearing in mind the effect that our jurisprudence and the basis of that has had on other peoples around the world. So in England, the problem we have really at the moment is that by not giving rights to nature, any lawyer that wants to advocate for nature is constantly having their advocacy with one hand tied behind their back. Actually, in many ways, both hands tied behind their back. When I was advocating for the Sheffield tree protesters, I was often having to make my arguments through the prism of human rights. So saying, "Oh, well, we know we must allow them to stand." What people were doing effectively was standing under trees that were being about to be chopped down to try and stop that. And the law was saying, "Well, you can't stand under the trees." And I was saying, "Well, under Article 10 of the Human Rights Act, they've got a right to freedom of speech and blah blah blah." And the judge was like, "Well, why don't they exercise that right just away from the tree then?" And of course, the whole thing was rubbish, because it wasn't about their freedom of speech at all. They didn't give monkeys about the Human Rights Act or any freedom of speech. It was they wanted to save that tree. But of course, there's no right in English law for that. The Highways Act said it could go. There's no general right to not chop a tree down in English law. The trees themselves have no rights. And that fundamental issue caused a huge loss of trees in Sheffield. But as I'll be going on to later, people power in many ways saves the day. Another example with trees is what's called tree preservation orders, which is the only form of protection we really have for trees in the English legal system. And they are not given out just generally to trees, and they're not even given out to trees that are particularly historic or amazing or anything. They're done on amenity values, so what they look like to humans. So there are many ancient trees, particularly in England and Wales, and there's one in Scotland. England has some of the most ancient yew trees in the world, some of them up to between 3,000 to 5,000 years old, that have zero legal protection because they're not covered by the amenity point, and we can't get TPOs for them. So someone could chop them down literally tomorrow, which is quite incredible when you think about it. And the final thing is, I suppose, is the sort of looking at lawyers themselves and the way they approach things. The English legal system is so predicated on defending property rights that almost every other interest, including that which is necessary for our own long-term survival, falls by the wayside when it comes to those property rights. And even with law itself, so you have this environmental law. I don't describe myself as an environmental lawyer, and I don't do environmental law. It's not some sort of set of rules that I'm applying to nature from humans. It's very interesting. If you Google environmental law barristers, the top set that comes up in England in London is called Landmark, and almost without fail, every single time I've been in court trying to protect nature, they've been on the other side. So these environmental lawyers, the ones who want to chop down 17,000 trees in Sheffield, want to stop HS2 protesters protecting their trees, and on and on and on and on like that. And so I describe myself as a wild lawyer, and I like the concept of wild law. And the idea of, I suppose, wild law for me is that it's, as a lawyer, I can apply environmental law, but actually my main object is to protect nature, and that can be in whatever way possible for me. And a lot of the time that actually means giving legal advice to local people who want to protect and defend their nature. So you've already mentioned a number of the examples of around the world where nature has been given rights. And the one that's very interesting for me is the, I always struggle to pronounce it, the Wahanguni River in New Zealand. And that's interesting for me because New Zealand is a common law country with a very similar legal system to England. And to me, the only difference clearly as to why they've got that groundbreaking act of the New Zealand Parliament that gives rights to the river is because of the strong Indigenous voice in the form of the Maori people. And that is, I think, for me, the thread that seems to run through most examples in the world where nature has been given rights is that strong Indigenous voice. So the question is, what happens in England and in the UK, because we don't have that voice anymore. And just to go in the depressing part of the talk, I think the idea that we're going to get any kind of act of parliament from the UK Parliament that gives rights to nature in the next decade or 2 decades, or frankly in the time it will take us before we destroy ourselves, is very unlikely. I can't see it happening. And as a lawyer, I get really funny looks when I even go. I don't even go that wild in court. I don't even go in there and say trees should have rights. It's like maybe we should. I go a lot more conservative than that, but I still get looked at by some judges in the High Court like I'm just batshit crazy for saying we shouldn't destroy our nature. So the whole system, it just seems unlikely that anything's going to happen anytime soon. But I also don't want to depress everyone too much. And I find also the idea that everyone else must wait for lawyers or politicians to come up with some kind of perfect answer to this problem is very disempowering. What do you all do when you're sitting on this call? To sit there and feel depressed that the UK Parliament's never going to give us an act of Parliament to give rights to nature. And so I just want to also briefly go into the idea of what a right is, because I think we have a very sometimes two-dimensional idea of it, seeing it just as an act of Parliament or something that a judge can grant. Actually, for me, rights can be very different. Can be lots of different things, and they're not just based on what is strictly in the law. A right can also be given by a sense of power or by direct action, and also by people acting according to that right. So for me, there's a great power in the idea of a declaration. So if you declare something and then act as if you believe in that, that can have a power. There's also, if you think about it, law is constantly changing according to declaration. So in the American Revolution, a bunch of people got together and said, using violence effectively, like, actually, this is the law we want. I'm not saying we should do violence, but the tradition we can look to more readily is perhaps the Gandhian tradition of saying, actually, sure, you say these are your laws, but actually we think this should be the law, and we're going to act on that basis. And actually, if I was to say, if the perfect way forward would be to have an act of Parliament with a strong group of people committed and dedicated to upholding that, which is what you see in New Zealand. You've got the Act of Parliament, you've got the Maoris who will enforce it. But if I could have to choose one or the other, so if I could either choose just an Act of Parliament that gives rights to nature, or a strong group of committed citizens who want to uphold the rights of nature and to fight to protect and defend nature, I'd definitely choose the latter. Because an Act of Parliament by itself is useless. We've got loads of laws at the moment that are just completely ignored. And there's another, there's trees being chopped down almost every day, probably, against TPOs, but because no one does anything, no one notices, they get away with it. Rivers being polluted, etc., etc., etc. And so I think the Sheffield example for me was the perfect example of how rights actually are often more about power than about strictly what the law is.
Yeah.
So in Sheffield, there was no legal right to save those trees. And actually, I lost every single case I did for them other than that initial advice. So I lost every single case. But they won. And they won because they ultimately, they took the rights of Sheffield. They made up the rights of Sheffield trees, right? They said, no, actually, these trees have a right to be here. They have a right to life. They have a right to exist. And then crucially said, and you're not taking them. And there's an amazing quote from an environmentalist in the 70s who was really in favor of quite gnarly direct action. And he said, for me, the essence of conservation lies in the word no. Say no, mean no, fight to protect the places we have. And in Sheffield, what happened was the police and the council came back harder and harder and harder, getting ever stricter injunctions that basically meant they could put people in prison for standing under a tree. And every time they did that, sorry.
No, I was just going to say that's really it's really powerful explanation, and also the thing that you said, which is absolutely key, which is the cultural aspect of things, and how do you shift, highlighting that the systems where things move are where people have that connection with nature, and if you're in a system that is very divorced from that, is it right to be relying on that? Trying to push the law or actually creating the community frameworks, and can that go first? So I think that's really helpful. I'm just going to move us on, bearing in mind where we are with time, but we'd love to hear more from you when we come back as well. Thanks so much, Paul, and I'm sure we'll have really lots of I can see already there are questions for you in our
okay.
So thanks so much. Now we're going to be moving on to Carlotta. So what would you say, following on from what Paul's been telling us, has been lost to Western society through the desacralization of nature and through the experiences of your work?
Thanks, Geeta, and thanks, Paul. Lots of interesting points raised. So that's a really big question, Geeta. I'm glad you gave me some time to think about it ahead of the discussion. But I think it's an interesting one in the context of our discussion on the rights of nature, because most earth-centered law, as Paul has been saying, is emerging from the grassroots upwards. It's emerging from communities, and in many cases those communities understand the natural world to be sacred. So if we look to countries with strong national legislation recognizing nature as a subject of law, and I'm thinking of New Zealand, which Paul has mentioned, and Ecuador and Bolivia, which you've mentioned, Geeta, and also Uganda most recently. In these countries, Indigenous groups and their sacred conception of nature were influential, and for instance, in the case of New Zealand, pivotal. The law was born out of decades of treaty settlement agreements. So having said that, though, in the US, over 30 municipalities have recognised rights of nature in local legislation. So in the US, there's a recognition that it's not possible to get through a national law, as Paul has been saying is the case also in the UK. But there's been lots of community action to get recognition of the rights of nature at local level. So I think that that's something that should be further pursued in contexts where it's not possible to get through law at national level because there's not political will. But it seems to me that a sense of the sacred often underlies an earth-centered orientation. And if you understand the world to be sacred, then you're attentive to the world around you. You regulate your interactions with the world accordingly, and you understand yourself to be a small part of something much bigger and more mysterious than you can really conceive of. And there's a humility and a respect that grows from that worldview. And within dominant culture in the West, the prevailing view of the world is as a collection of objects rather than as a communion of subjects, to use Thomas Berry's language. But it's not just in the West. Our global systems are guided by this mechanistic worldview. Drawing on the experiences of the African Earth jurisprudence movement, certainly a sense of the sacred is very alive among the communities that are agitating for earth-centered law at local level, even within the context of these global systems that say otherwise. And this view is really the foundation of the work. So reverence for and intimacy with the natural world is embedded in these communities. It's a living reality. It's alive in their rituals, in their practices, their stories, their traditions, and their customary laws. And this quality of relationship is not something that can be imposed by legislation from the top down. And I want to draw out that the communities are working with a very different conception of law to law as we commonly conceive of it in the West. So this is not state law made up of national and local legislation and court decisions. This is law with a very different origin. So these laws have been passed down orally from generation to generation, sometimes over millennia. They come in the form of myth and song and story. And these communities that our earth jurisprudence practitioners work with, they look to nature to discern their laws. So these laws derive from a deep knowledge of the wider ecology and a deep relationship with that ecology. And some of the communities that our practitioners work with, they have come close to losing these traditions and stories and laws through years of colonialism and marginalisation. But this conception of law and this sense of the sacred in nature is something that a community can recover and reintegrate. And so using community processes, our practitioners accompany communities to nurture the revival of their earth-centred practices. And as part of this process, and often over several years, communities will hold intergenerational dialogues, and it's the elders that hold a lot of the memory. And often this journey will begin with a practical focus, so a revival of agroecological farming and a revival of indigenous seeds and seed-saving practices. And the seeds are for crop cultivation, but also for rituals that most often take place in sacred natural sites. And these sites are natural places of great ecological, cultural and spiritual significance to the community, and they're considered to be critical to the health and resilience of the earth as a whole. So spiritual leaders within the community will perform rituals in these sites to maintain equilibrium and balance in the territory. So when Indigenous seed is revived, so too are the rituals, and so too is the will of the community to protect sacred natural sites and their sacred relationship with nature. And at this stage, discussions will often begin to focus on the laws that govern human behaviour in the sacred natural sites and in the wider territory. And I share this to suggest that sacred relationships with nature can be recovered. But to round up now, as Thomas Berry developed his philosophy of earth jurisprudence, he had two key sources of inspiration. So he looked to nature, which he very much understood to be sacred, and of which he understood humans to be an integral part. And he also looked to Indigenous worldviews, and this was the foundation of his vision. But his vision was that humans across the world re-establish a mutually enhancing presence as part of the earth community. So he understood this transformation to be the work of every single one of us. And he said that intimacy with the planet and its wonder and beauty and the full depth of its meaning is what enables an integral human relationship with the planet. And I think it's for us in our different ways as individuals, as communities, to step into that relationship, one of wonder or perhaps even reverence, and for that relationship to be the grounding and the orientation for our future actions.
Thanks, Carlotta. And how has that worked? Because you were saying that's happened in the kind of community context. Has that rubbed up against institutions or legal structures in those countries, or has it been able to work within that framework, or has there not been that interaction yet?
Well, the different communities are at different stages. So sometimes they're sort of beginning with farming and seeds, and some of them reach a point where they're working on their laws. And although these laws are kind of traditionally oral, they might get to a stage where they decide that they want to document these laws. And with one community that we're working with in Uganda, the local district council became very enthused by this process, and so there's the possibility that some of these Indigenous laws may be implemented through local legislation. So that's an example of how two very different legal systems are somehow finding some sort of point of connection. And of course in Africa many of the countries are plurilegal, so they have state law, which is often the product of colonization, and then they have the customary laws, which predate the state law by centuries, and constitutions will recognise customary laws as well as national and constitutional law. So there is this space for the two to coexist, but of course they are very different. So that is a careful dance.
Thanks, Carla. So that's super inspiring to hear, and perhaps some encouragement for how things could develop over time in the UK if there start to be communities of practice, and how they might perhaps help influence the legal system. But in any case, the fact that these are happening in different parts of the world, and in the case of Thomas Berry's words, people are starting from different places, and so there is that possibility of cultures being able to develop and grow, and then other cultures being able to learn and adapt in whatever ways suit them. So really inspiring to hear. So Laura, could you tell us a little bit more about the work that you've been doing with communities and how on rights of nature issues, and what the responses you've had have been?
Yes. I guess the first community I engaged with the rights of nature was actually the one I grew up with. I grew up in a rural area in the south of Catalonia. It's the area where the river that we call Ebre, it melts into the sea, and it's a place in which for the last 20 years there's been a very strong activism grassroots movement to protect the river and the area, as the government was repeatedly trying to pass a law to transfer the water from the river to the metropolitan area, which would really threaten the flow of the river and would damage the whole ecosystem. But well, that's where I come from. And then last year with Convex, we had the opportunity to create a piece of work, a performance for Totally Thames, as I mentioned. And at Convex, our work is often based on rights, defending some kind of civil rights, or presenting issues that are hidden normally from the public eye. And when we had the opportunity to work with Totally Thames on something that would relate to the Thames, and thinking how can we approach it, we started researching on river rights, and then is when we found out how, as Paul and Carlota have mentioned, how Indigenous communities in various places in the world, Colombia, New Zealand and India, made very tangible and relevant achievements on protection law of their rivers. And we wondered about the power of this deep connection between culture and nature, and how this is the key, or sounds like is a bit of a key for protecting entire ecosystems. So then with this idea of being very aware of these communities and these spiritual connections to nature, and looking at the Thames and looking at Londoners, the wide London community, and how do we relate to the Thames? What's our relationship? What do we? How can we care for a river? Many questions that we were wondering to create this piece. So then what we did is to create a series of workshops during the creation process of the performance, and we invited to those workshops people from the Indian communities, the Maori, the Colombian, and other volunteers that were interested in the theme, and we facilitated a series of creative activities that led to reflect and discuss about the following questions. So the questions were, what words do you associate with your river? And with your river, we meaning the river that you feel more connected to. What does your river need? How can you care for your river? How does the river make you feel? Then after this discussion, these responses were integrated very much into the performance, and I think it would be a bit too much to share a lot, but I would like to share some of the responses to the question of what does the river need, as is a more nature-centered question rather than anthropocentric. So we are really asking someone to be on the skin or the water of the river and feel what are the needs of the river. So some of the answers were freedom, no enslaving, rights, the river needs attention, love, awareness, to flow, a voice, cleaning, litter picking, campaigning, prayers, guardians, restoration, accountability, stories, narrative, legal protection. Then we presented the performance in the Totally Thames in London, inviting the wider London community on a meditative ritualistic walk along the Thames in the area of Rotherhithe. The whole performance was encompassing singing to the river and unveiling facts about river rights. So it was unveiling what happened with the Whanganui River in New Zealand, and how the Maori community have this duty of care of the river. What happened in India with the law on 2017 and the overturning of that law by the central government. So during the performance, while we were walking and singing, we were unveiling these facts about river rights and making our participants aware of the rights of nature concerning rivers. And the whole aim of this performance was to provoke awareness and invite Londoners to connect deeper to their local river, because I guess that's a bit in the ethos of how we do it, how we unveil these facts, what's the character it has. So the character is very much meditative, mesmerizing, insightful. That was some of the feedback that we got. Spiritual, magical. So everyone holding robes with flags of facts, singing to the river, being very much united and connected. So that's the experience that we created with Talweg. Yes, and then also highlighting different visions of the relationships that we were pointing out about this. Indigenous communities that have this very strong relationship with the rivers, and I think you were mentioning the Yamuna seen as a goddess in Hinduism, the river Ganges seen as a mother, and also we engaged with the Ngati Ranana Maori community in London, and one of the leaders of the community told us that his family was a direct descendant of the river. They call it Te Awa Tupua, and we're talking about the river Whanganui. I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce it as well. Then I found very interesting as well when we were speaking to someone before doing the performance, but on the creation process, and we were speaking to someone on the Western society about river rights, about personhood status of rivers, about someone saying they're the descendant of the river, and I think everyone feels quite surprised and even shocked and thinking, how is that working? Because as a culture we are alienated from nature, and we see nature as a thing to enjoy rather than being in the same whole system. And I think when you start to relate things more deeply, like you think, okay, I am 60% of water, I drink water from the Thames, maybe I'm a descendant of the Thames in some way, right? So but then we had I wanted to share a bit the feedback also on Talweg. So people who participated in that experience, they said that they felt very much connected to nature. They said that they never felt more connected to a river before. They said that it was meditative, insightful, spiritual, magical, and we value this very positively because we think to bring awareness in an embodied way and in a feeling this spiritual connection as well is a very important first step towards then direct action that we were mentioning as well in another talk. Can I point out to previous question to the?
Yeah, sure. If you wanted to make a comment on something someone had said,
Yeah, exactly. About the question that we were talking about, the desacralization of nature and other things, and I think I'm as an artist, I'm very interested in what role the creative arts can play in enhancing this connection with nature. So I really relate that very strongly with what we have lost as a Western society in the desacralization of nature and what creative arts bring because I think creative arts brings something from the sacred world that we have lost, and that is ritual, that was also mentioned by Carlota as one of the things that keep the connection strong in the indigenous communities. But when we are part of a performance, we take part in a ritual, and that brings us a feeling of belonging. That is a collective, embodied and spiritual experience, and that brings us to celebrate, to honor, and to acknowledge something in more depth that we would normally do on our daily lives. So that's why I think that the creative arts are, when they are articulating their rituals around nature, have really the power to bring back this sacred element to a society that has lost it.
Well, thanks so much, Laura, for bringing in that other aspect which Carlota was also speaking to, that is inherent to the cultures which see themselves as part of a natural system. It involves myth, it involves story, it involves ritual, and the ways that you've been exploring, bringing that back to London, which is in some ways a microcosm of the wider world. You were able to find representatives of Indigenous communities in London where these changes have been made, but also with the river in London and Londoners' connection and ways of developing that. So thanks so much for sharing that. Then we come to our final panel question, which is for Shivali. And I wanted to ask Shivali, do you think humans are basically wired to be at their happiest and healthiest if they see themselves, or if they're connected as part of a wider natural ecosystem? What are your views on that?
Thanks, Geeta. So I think the kind of times we're living in now has shown us the answer to that question. A recent survey showed that 9% of Brits wanted to return to their normal life, so to speak, and things like we're seeing now: cleaner air, we're spending less money, we're engaging more community-based or family-based activities, and it's quite attractive, it seems. And so I guess this is one of the greatest gifts of the pandemic. One podcast I was listening to actually describes coronavirus as climate change or on steroids, because I guess it's showing us this kind of deep consequence of our disregard for the environment, but also the opportunities that it presents at a much faster rate than what the climate issues are going to show. And I guess the opportunity part is the part we need to strongly emphasize, because climate change offers the possibility to imagine a life close to what makes us healthier and happier. And during the pandemic, a lot of us were turning more to our green spaces. On the first weekend of lockdown in the UK, Snowdon saw its highest number of attendees in history. And areas with higher pollution have also been shown to have poorer outcomes from coronavirus. So, who doesn't want cleaner air, more nurturing, community-centric environment, eating fresh foods? And we know kind of the threats are massive. And of course, all of this feels obvious, and we want to create a more wholesome environment for our next generation. But I guess the question is kind of what is holding us back? And I suppose that's what I wanted to focus on a little bit more. Now, coming from a health background, I guess some of my best examples come from that. And as Paul said, how law comes from a human-centric approach, medicine is not any different in that respect. Medicine was always a huge colonizing force across the world. For example, knowledge on infectious disease was superior to anywhere else in the world, and infectious disease was always the biggest killer in history. So from that, Western medicine was obviously more superior and built upon that. So it's always been built by this kind of human-centric approach of doing everything that's absolutely possible rather than prizing sufficiency of care. So in this context, we could argue that we are therefore not acting to make humans healthier or happier, but we're only acting to make humans healthier and happier, but not necessarily taking into account the environment. The second challenge is the number of industries that obviously we have built now, from the pharmaceutical industry to the food industry. Dan posted one question about that. And I guess we kind of pose them as these kind of big bad industries, but behind these industries are just people kind of, I suppose like you and me, they're trying to get by, look after their families, and there's a huge kind of emotional investment involved in that. So unpicking all of that is hugely complicated. And I guess third is the COVID-19 response relied on this huge global collective effort, and that was only possible because we have this complexity of societies to support our health systems, and ultimately this is driven by money and taxation. So we've kind of built up these very complicated societies, and trying to unpick that, having this community-based way of living, is going to be more challenging because there are certain sacrifices that we're going to have to make. Are we happy to prize kind of, okay, that's enough care for myself, I don't need any further medical care? Would we be okay with that kind of health system? These are kind of difficult questions that we are going to ask ourselves. And obviously human beings are also not known for making decisions to necessarily increase happiness. One could argue that as hunter-gatherers out in the wild, we were more engaged with our environment than working in factories, but we prized having control over our environment over kind of freedom to roam out in the wild, and that control has led to destruction of many communities, indigenous communities, which were less demanding of the environment. So I guess the simple answer to your question is yes, Geeta, we obviously are happier and healthier if we're more connected, but it's also about personal and collective desire. Do we envision a world where we want everybody to live well and have a bit, or do we want a very few to live very well? And so far we can see with the number of billionaires in the world, we're kind of not prepared to always make those sacrifices. But to end on a hopeful and positive note, I think coronavirus has made us see that behavioural change is possible rapidly and globally, and governments can also make those changes. Of course, the unknown is difficult, and it's going to require strong leadership, but individually and collectively we can make those changes, and I guess forums like this are great places to inspire and encourage that.
Just to follow up on that so many, well, not so many, but a number of diseases we've seen have come from ecosystem destruction. So coronavirus is one of them, but it's not by any means the first, and it may not be the last. Do you see that at some point leading to the health profession becoming more engaged on issues like ecosystem destruction, or perhaps society more broadly starting to factor that in, that even a small group of people can't be immune from wider environmental impact?
I would say kind of, well, from a medical journal perspective, this is always something that they've been tuned into, especially kind of epidemiology, public health professionals, as you're seeing right now. They have always been advocating, obviously, to shut the borders early, all of these kind of changes. And for example, with coronavirus, it came down to the fact that wild animals were put into contact with human beings. That probably wasn't meant to happen, and this is increasingly going to happen with as we destroy marine habitats and environmental. So this is something that health professionals are very aware of, but obviously we can only give the advice and present the science, and it's the policymakers and governments that need to implement those changes, and that's where the difficulty lies.
Thanks. So now I'm going to move on to our final question to our panel. But before I do that, it's just a reminder to all of you that please could you type your questions in for our panel. If you haven't already done so, do that now, so that we have them for the breakout. And if you would like to join the breakout, could you please raise your hand? So that's if you would like to join the breakout. So I'm going to start with Shivali for our question for our final reflections from our panel before we go into our breakout, and that's just ask you to talk a little bit about your personal relationship with nature, and how does that impact your life, and what you do in the world.
Sure. Can you hear me properly? Yeah, that's fine. Okay. So I guess I don't think I have enough time with nature. I think doctors spend the vast majority of their time in a overheated, artificially lit ward, and I suppose that's your training, and that's how you kind of work as well. And now as an editor, working in office, now in an apartment in London. So I try and visit nature as much as I can, and I'm grateful that.
Well, mic is crackling a little bit, so I'm not sure.
Okay.
Your headphone.
Let me try this. Is that better?
Yeah. Great. Thank you.
So I guess it's about visiting the nature as much as I can. And I'm grateful that, you know, the communities that I'm part of kind of have nature at the heart of its practice. For example, there's a beautiful community in Hungary. They're completely off the grid, self-sufficient with over 50 different types of fruits and vegetables, and they don't rely on any kind of external source. And there's one key text, and one key quote that sticks with me actually is that how we should be relating to nature, in that a wise person should see all tiers of society and all varieties of animals and even small organisms with equal vision. And this really draws me back to the point of what is important and how we're deeply connected, not just to each other, but the environment, animals, and everything in between. And we have a great number of resources, but we're also deeply vulnerable in that. And as we've seen again from the pandemic, unfortunately, like many of us, I'm become a city dweller, and we just end up craving the natural world rather than living in it. And it's a state that many of us have come to be in. And I guess the problem that we have as cities is where the jobs are, where the energy lies, and that in itself is maybe an addiction of some sort. So I try to disconnect every year by attending some sort of retreat, because I realize how important this is. And I'm grateful that there are so many of us who realize the importance of that, trying to make that shift in our lives, and collectively we can kind of shift that kind of mentality, whether it's planting more trees or going out into the environment more. But it's something that's always a work in progress for me.
Thanks, Shivali. I've just seen that there are some comments in the chat box about how you raise your hand. So if you go to the participants list, you click on that, you'll see that there's a symbol and you can put the raised hand symbol. So hopefully that clarifies that. And so continuing in reverse order, Laura?
Yes, yeah, I'm now looking at my window, and in a way I'm very grateful that I can see a lot of green, and if I actually look at the other side as well. So I think there's something in London that also, maybe as me coming from another country, in which cities that I've lived, like Barcelona, don't have really those amazing green spaces or back gardens or just space to breathe that is not concrete. So feels very something that I really, really appreciate. Yeah, and then, yeah, of course, that's very much part of my well-being. We also, do some gardening, and also as a bit of a way, investigating a bit on permaculture, investigating a bit on I think it's an ongoing life research to think about building a more sustainable life, even in a place like London at the moment. I think you have to accept also the place you are, and of course think about what that means and what you really need from a place, or what the place, how can you contribute to a place, this kind of dual relationship. So I think is a life research as well, in many aspects. Also, as Shivali was pointing, in this coexistence of species, and how you acknowledge the different organisms and animals and species and plants, and as much the deeper you look and the more you look, the more fascinating it is, and the more you respect and you want to know more and protect all of this. And I guess all of this really influences the kind of routines and decisions that you do on your daily life, how you consume, how you shop for food, how do you work, how you travel, how you relate to others. So yeah, I guess it's part of my personal and professional research, this relationship with nature.
Thanks so much, Laura, and that's really important. I think that melding of that also Paul spoke to earlier, the melding of the personal and the professional. Are we at a point where those two things have to be in sync for the sake of the planet, if not ourselves? Carlotta.
Okay, I think it's Paul next, but I'm happy to corrupt the order. Oh no, it is me. Sorry. I'm wrong. Excuse me. Okay, my personal relationship with the more than human world. It's a relationship I've been trying to deepen over the past 10 years or so. So I'm from inner city London, but around 10 years ago I began engaging with community food growing in urban community gardens in London. And also I would go off and woof in rural eco communities in Wales and Scotland and England. And actually, a year after qualifying as a lawyer, I decided I would throw it all in and be a food grower. So for a year and a half, I was at Schumacher College and I was growing food there. And that's where I met Geeta. And I think that growing food and tending to land is a really good way to re-establish a relationship with the rest of the natural world. And for me, it was really nourishing on a lot of levels, and also just fabulous to be embodied and outside after many years at a desk, sitting down and staring at a screen. But I'm a bit more desk-based these days. And I'm not growing food, I don't have access to land, but I do a lot of foraging for wild herbs, which you might call weeds. But most days I go out and I forage, and I have some favourite spots that I really get to know, and I pick herbs for teas, for salads. I have a daily green smoothie. So today I had one with a lot of nettles. And yeah, I think in the context of the pandemic and the lockdown, actually, where there's less inter-human interaction, there's so much more space I'm finding for interspecies interaction. So I'm communing with plants and noticing birds and relating to trees in a kind of much more present way than I would have done, I think, were it not for this pandemic period. And in terms of other personal practices, well, as part of our Earth jurisprudence trainings, we do sit spots. We have a regular practice of choosing a space in nature nearby, and that could be, I use that nature loosely. It could be a park or a tree nearby your house, and you just develop a relationship with that place, and you return regularly, and you go and you sit there and you simply observe, or in the words of Colin Campbell, who leads some of our wilderness immersion, the wilderness immersion component of our trainings, and I know he's spoken at an Advaya event as well, you render yourself pervious to nature, and in so doing, actually, it's amazing what can happen. So I really recommend that. And as well as sit spots, we also spend longer periods in nature. I've been fortunate to do a night vigil in a wilderness area with some of our practitioners, and that is a process that should be held. So I don't recommend going off and doing one of those alone. But again, that's really prompted a very powerful shift for me in moving from this sense of nature as a collection of objects and out there to being very much part of a communion of subjects. And so yeah, those are some of my personal practices.
Oh, that sounds wonderful, and I think I'll be in touch for wild foraging tips and smoothie making tips too. So that just sounds great. And Paul,
So I have recently, when I've been doing tree work, I've been sort of trying to, I suppose, change the way in which I perceive what I'm doing. So actually seeing the trees as my clients a bit more, which I think many of my colleagues would see as quite mad, but it's actually very satisfying. Especially as in a lot of times I'm not getting paid for this work. So it's nice to build up a relationship with that tree. And there's recently a tree up in North London called the Happy Man tree, which is being threatened. I was giving them some advice. And after everyone else left, I sort of had a little moment with myself and hugged the tree and sort of put my hand on it and sort of spoke to it and said that it was an honour to help protect it and to represent it. And that kind of feeling is really magical and makes it all worthwhile. And actually I did the first kind of more badass activism this week, and I actually climbed the tree to occupy it when they're trying to chop it down, which is quite fun. But the main way I connect with nature is through water, I think. And I've lived on a boat for 8 years. And 3 years ago I moved to the River Roding in East London, which is an abandoned river. Effectively no one lived in it. No one was doing anything with it. It was just in a very sorry state. And set up a community of boaters to try and restore it. And I guess this is kind of a practical example of what I was talking about earlier, that, you know, that the river eroding doesn't have rights, and if we tried to get them passed, they would laugh at us. But actually, effectively, we are now, our group of voters is kind of upholding the rights of the river, both in practical terms. You know, we do a lot of litter picking and planting trees and looking out for wildlife and seeing what's going on in the river. Also, in the sense of, like, I think other people alluded to it, when a river, when you give an intention of love, I suppose, to a place, it reflects in that place, but also in very much in legal ways as well. So, for instance, I found out a couple of weeks ago there's actually a thing called a litter abatement order, that anyone can apply for if an area is full of litter. So one of the rights we want to have for nature is, especially rivers, is to remove rubbish, right? But we're not going to get Parliament to pass that law, but they already have. It's in the Environment Act 1990. You just write to the authority who's supposed to be in charge of it and say, remove this rubbish by this date, or we'll get an order to stop making you do it. So I've already written that letter to the person who's supposed to be in charge of it. And also, I suppose, as well, trying to foster that relationship between local people and their river and make it into a more sacred space. And I think, yeah, for me, seeing nature as sacred and as reverential has been I suppose, the precursor to the work that I'm now doing. And I think that's the most important part. So for all of you to connect with nature, I suppose, go to nature, go to your rivers, go to your trees, treat them as sacred, and then work out how you can practically manifest that, because you all can, everyone can. And that's what really makes a difference. And who knows, one day we might get an act of Parliament for the river eroding. But in the meantime, no one is gonna mess with her while our little group of voters are there, because we love her.
Yeah, and that's what we need. Hopefully at some point you or someone who has that feeling will become a judge, and then that's how changes.
I think I'm too much of a loose cannon to become a judge.
Oh, who knows? Well, yeah, that's absolutely key, though, as you're saying. It's and just to, for the sake of full disclosure, because you've all done that, I'll mention a little bit too that I wrote a blog after I left Friends of the Earth about my local park, and it was kind of a slightly tongue-in-cheek title of Nature as a Life Coach, and it was about how much it helped me sort of go through what felt like burnout and what I learned from just taking park walks. And I was really astonished by the level of response of people telling me about their favourite trees or their favourite connection or how much their local parks meant to them. And I thought, this is really, really common. Like, everyone does it, but no one ever says, no, like, you're going to go and see your friend or something. You don't go and see, oh, I'm going to go and see my favorite tree, or I'm going to hang out with the river I really like. You don't articulate it in those terms, but for so many people it's so powerful. So I think that's an encouraging thing.
Do you see, and so this is for Paul, do you see any other areas of our existing legal framework which are ripe for setting new precedents that would give rise to rights that protect nature? And which was related to Ian's question, which was asking if Parliament's Net Zero 2050 law that was introduced last year was something to be hopeful about.
Okay, Paul, and I know that, of course, you're a civil lawyer, so this isn't technically your field, and so, of course, you know, do go ahead, and if I can help out on anything, I will.
Yeah. So the Heathrow decision was a really good one, and there are potential other uses for it. That was actually done. The Heathrow decision, there were multiple parties to it, and it was Friends of the Earth, but also a group called Plan B, which is basically one guy and his assistant. And it was the Plan B line of argument that actually won out in the end, and has potentially massive ramifications for the way our legal system deals with climate change, and how that impacts upon infrastructure planning, lots of different things. So I think that's a good lesson, that you can change things even if you're small. But for me, that's I guess on a rather large scale, and I'm much more interested in the small scale actions of ordinary people taking on the protection of nature in their area. And I think there's a legal ecosystem, perhaps, of all different people acting in different ways, and you need the Plan Bs and the Client Earths and everyone else, but you also need the people at the bottom supporting those who are directly protecting nature. And that's where I guess my real interest lies.
Absolutely, and that, you know, you, as you say, you need that strategic litigation, but you need people on the ground. This is everyone connecting and protecting their local areas, and every area is important as every other.
Also, on one final thing that occurs to me as well is that we need to be careful as well, of course, how we deal with carbon and climate versus nature. So, for instance, HS2 is actually really carbon intensive for various reasons. But imagine it wasn't. Imagine if HS2 would save carbon. Does that then justify smashing through loads of ancient forests? And actually, we're going to see, I think, more and more over the next few years, many solutions to climate change which are actually going to be very destructive of nature. And this is some of the hoo-ha that happened around Planet of the Humans recently. It was not a good film, bad angle to take on it, but that's that kind of question of in solving climate change and in reducing carbon, are we forgetting about the protection of nature more broadly, or even worse, are we actually making it worse while we're destroying nature in order to reduce carbon?
Yeah, and that really speaks to what you've been saying, the other panelists in our previous session, which is the real key importance of an integrated approach and not trying to split off one thing, but trying to see it in that holistic way that is solving a number of problems together. Great, thanks, Paul. Our next question, please, Ruby.
So this question, I can't remember who asked it, but it was for both Shivali and Paul, and it was asking, do you think that there is legal precedent for prioritisation of public health over economic growth now that global governments have unanimously agreed on it? Can we use these definitions of climate change as a public health threat to build a case against it?
Shivali, do you want to start on that?
Yeah, sure. So I think I put a brief reply on this. So already certain NHS trusts have actually recognised that we should declare climate change as a public health emergency, and this was declared. And there has been advocacy around encouraging other big health organisations to do this similarly. For instance, the World Health Organization and the BMJ has been quite vocal on that since quite early on. So short answer to that, yes. I think health should be backing that. I think with obviously the scientific background and obviously people respect health professionals and their opinions, so we should use that position to promote that.
Paul?
I'm not sure something I'm expert enough in to give a reasoned answer on, I think. So I will defer to Shivali.
Sure. Next question, please, Ruby.
This was from Kat. What is the relationship between the legal rights of nature movement and the existing human rights framework? Sorry, I read that wrong. What is the relationship between the legal rights of nature movement and the existing human rights framework? Are they compatible, or is the human rights framework blocking more significant change?
Paul?
Well, yeah, I would say that human rights and the rights of nature are two sides of the same coin. So, for instance, you have the human right to life, to clean water, in many jurisdictions, to a healthy environment. And for me, it's a nonsense to have those rights and not to have the rights of nature to exist and to function and to flourish, because we derive our life and our food and our water and our health from the earth. That's primary. So yeah, I think it's a nonsense to have the human rights framework without the rights of nature. And interestingly, the current UN Special Rapporteur on human rights, Dr. David Boyd, he has also written a book on the rights of nature, and at the moment he's doing a study on the human right to a healthy environment and how state parties can realise that right. And I'm submitting on the rights of nature, and I'm sure it's at the foreground of the fore of his mind as well. So yeah, I would say that they are interlinked and complementary. I'm not aware of ways in which human rights sort of obstruct, but as Paul has drawn out earlier, of course, property rights, which reign supreme in many jurisdictions, are